Welcome back to The Explainer. So today we're diving into something pretty wild, the hidden financial playbooks of America's commanders-in-chief. You know, we usually think about presidents in terms of power, right? Legacy, historical impact. But what about the money? How much wealth did the people sitting in the Oval Office actually have, and exactly how did they get it? Well, the answers are probably going to surprise you, and as we'll see, the journey to extreme presidential wealth has taken some pretty fascinating turns throughout American history. Our source material actually kicks things off with this brilliantly sarcastic quote. "We Americans, we only elect people to public office who represent us. You know, working class Americans who truly represent the will of the people." I'm kidding. It totally shatters that illusion of the paycheck-to-paycheck politician, because the reality, the vast majority of folks at the highest levels of government possess net worths that most of us can barely even wrap our heads around. We're talking about massive assets, things of immense value that can easily be converted to cash. Just to set a baseline here, the current annual presidential salary is $400,000 a year, plus a quote-unquote measly $50,000 expense account. But listen, a $400K paycheck is just the tip of the iceberg. We aren't just talking about their government salaries today. We are examining true extreme asset accumulation. We're looking at peak wealth, the absolute most money and assets these individuals held during their lifetimes. Okay, let's dive right in. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover 1. The working class myth, 2. Early plantation wealth, 3. Inheritance and marriage, 4. Real estate investments, 5. The post-presidency boom, and 6. Patterns of wealth. Alright, section 1. The working class myth and financial extremes. To really wrap our heads around the extremes of presidential wealth, we kind of have to look at the exact opposite ends of the spectrum. The financial realities of our presidents vary wildly. Take Harry Truman. By most accounts, he is our poorest president. The guy worked odd jobs, spent time in railroad construction, and famously had a hat shop that completely failed. He actually struggled so much that Congress literally doubled the presidential salary to $100,000 in 1949 just to help him out. And even after leaving office, things were so tight that Congress had to create the presidential pension. Truman actually got the very first Medicare card. Now, flip the script and contrast that with Donald Trump, America's first billionaire president. Yes, Trump donates his presidential salary, but our source points out that the idea he was working for nothing is a bit misleading. He continued to profit from a massive, privately held real estate empire while in office, which even led to lawsuits arguing he violated the Constitution's emoluments clauses. The gap between these two financial realities is absolutely staggering. Moving on to section 2. Early plantation wealth, land, and enslaved labor. So in the early days of the Republic, extreme wealth wasn't built on, corporate stocks or million-dollar book deals. It was built on vast land speculation and, tragically, enslaved labor. This table neutrally reports the staggering physical and human property assets of the founding fathers and early presidents. Look at George Washington. He owned 5 separate farms, spanning 8,000 acres of some of the absolute richest farmland in Virginia, and owned over 300 slaves. Thomas Jefferson inherited massive tracts of land, eventually building his famous 5,000-acre Monticello plantation, and owned more than 600 slaves over his lifetime, which is actually the most of any president. James Madison inherited great wealth and became the largest landowner in Orange County, Virginia, with 5,000 acres and over 100 slaves. Later on, Zachary Taylor inherited land across multiple states, speculated heavily, and owned a massive plantation with about 80 slaves. This was literally the engine of extreme wealth in America's earliest days. And this brings up a pretty fascinating irony when we look at Andrew Jackson. Historians love to call him our first common man president, right? He grew up poor, started as a saddle maker, did some teaching, but hey, don't let the branding fool you. Jackson actually became the 5th wealthiest president of all time. His law practice flourished, he made money in the military, and crucially, he acquired over 1,000 acres of amazing land in Tennessee. Over his life, he owned as many as 300 slaves. So the so-called common man was, in reality, a card-carrying member of the extreme elite. Which brings us to section 3, inheritance and marriage, or, as I like to call it, securing the fortune. You see, a lot of these presidents didn't have to build their fortunes from scratch. They had the bag secured way before they ever took the oath of office. Marrying into money is practically a time-honored tradition in presidential politics. Warren Harding owed much of his wealth to his wife, Mabel, who was a wealthy banker's daughter. Franklin Pierce's wife, Jane, brought substantial family wealth to the table. John Tyler, who was actually the 11th richest president in history, married Letitia, who came from a ridiculously wealthy old money family. And then, of course, there's John F. Kennedy. While his dad was already one of the richest men in the country, his wife Jackie also brought immense wealth to the marriage. As our source playfully points out, her family had oil money. And no, not literal oily cash, which would be gross, but immense wealth derived from the oil industry. But beyond marriages, direct inheritances played a massive role too. Just look at the Roosevelts. Teddy Roosevelt had a massive family trust fund. His family was so wealthy and connected that he could just spend his entire adult life in politics without ever sweating a paycheck. FDR similarly inherited a ton, which he combined with his wife Eleanor's wealth and sustained through real estate. Then we have George H.W. Bush. He was born into significant wealth and used those inherited connections to build an offshore oil drilling company, which just completely compounded his family's fortune. Alright, jumping to section 4, real estate investments and self-made fortunes. But hey, not everyone relied on old money. Let's talk about the presidents who built their own fortunes through savvy market moves and pure business acumen. Some were genuinely self-made. Take Herbert Hoover. He was born poor and orphaned, but he became a mining engineer and eventually a global executive, amassing a massive fortune in the mining industry before he ever entered politics. Grover Cleveland had a really modest upbringing but got wealthy simply by being ridiculously smart with his money, making highly profitable real estate investments. And Lyndon B. Johnson, even as a career politician, he achieved immense wealth largely thanks to his wife Lady Bird. She wasn't just an heiress, she was incredibly business savvy, and her sharp investment skills ensured LBJ had highly profitable assets backing his political rise. Next up, Section 5, the post-presidency boom. This is all about cashing in after office. Fast forward to the modern era, and today, leaving the Oval Office is actually the biggest financial springboard of a politician's life. There is a very specific, highly reliable modern playbook for cashing in after public service, and it basically involves 3 steps. Step 1, publish incredibly lucrative memoirs with massive advance payouts. Step 2, command astronomical speaking fees. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single hour. And step 3, get on those corporate boards or launch media production companies. And it is wild how effectively this playbook has been executed. Gerald Ford made millions from book advances and serving on the boards of major corporations. Bill Clinton wasn't wealthy before his presidency, but after, he and Hillary generated massive wealth through huge book deals, paid speeches, and business consulting. Barack Obama had a pretty modest net worth entering office, but he's utilized this exact same strategy since leaving in 2017, earning hundreds of thousands per speech, selling millions of books, and even launching a production company with Michelle Obama. They have successfully turned their political legacies into multi-million-dollar corporate and media empires. To really see how much times have changed, let's compare 2 totally different post-presidential eras. Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant faced a series of failed investments after leaving office that left him completely bankrupt. He literally had to rush to write and publish his memoir while he was dying of throat cancer, just so his wife and kids wouldn't inherit his massive debt. Contrast that with George W. Bush. Before politics, he made millions in oil and owned the Texas Rangers baseball team. After his presidency, he's made tens of millions more thanks to speaking fees and book deals. The stark contrast between Grant's desperate struggle and Bush's highly lucrative post-presidency tells you everything you need to know about modern political wealth. Finally, Section 6, Patterns of Wealth and the Historical Trend. All of this data brings us to a pretty fascinating climax in this explainer. When you map out the wealth of every single president, a very distinct pattern emerges. You see this fascinating U-shaped pattern in presidential wealth, which proves that extreme wealth at the top of the ticket is both a very old tradition and a very modern reality. In the earliest years of the Republic, our presidents were incredibly rich land and plantation owners. Then there's this dip in the middle. The poorest presidents generally served from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And finally, as we look at the most recent years of the Republic, the wealth shoots right back up, creating that distinct historical U-shape. Let's zoom in on that dip for a second, the modest middle era. A lot of these presidents spent their lives in modest public service or even doing manual labor. Abraham Lincoln, arguably our most beloved president, is actually the 8th poorest in history. The guy spent his 20s doing manual labor, literally splitting wood all day. Chester Arthur, the 4th poorest, started his career as a teacher and a principal. James A. Garfield didn't seem to care about making money at all. He taught Greek and Latin and was a minister. Woodrow Wilson made a comfortable, but definitely not extreme living as a professor at Princeton. So for this brief window in American history, immense wealth was absolutely not a prerequisite for the Oval Office. Which brings us to our final, somewhat provocative thought drawn straight from our source material. Looking at this overwhelming historical data, from the sprawling plantations of the Founding Fathers to the multi-million-dollar book deals and real estate empires of the modern era, we really have to ask ourselves, does wealth matter when we talk about presidents? Is it just inevitable that most people who end up in public office happen to be wealthy? Or, to put it a little more bluntly, is the only way to get into Congress or to become president to first have a whole lot of wealth? It's a question that challenges the very core of our political system, and honestly, it's one that's definitely worth chewing on long after this explainer ends. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey today, and as always, keep asking the big questions.